Professor Mohammed, could you tell us a little about your academic background?
I started in gender studies, or rather feminism and activism, long before there was anything like gender studies on the campus. I wanted to do my postgraduate and I wanted to do an MSc in sociology, but the thesis that I actually did and wanted to do was on women, and it was called Women and Education in Trinidad in 1868 to 1960 or something, where I traced the development of women's education and the policies pertaining to women's education. And that predated any existence of gender studies on the campus, including predating the existence of something like Women and Development Studies groups or the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. And in fact, I think it would parallel in a way what Lucille Mathurin May would have started in Jamaica with her PhD thesis, which was published in 1970. So my first introduction to gender studies was in fact an MSc thesis. But parallel to that, I was very much of an activist, being one of the quote-unquote leaders of the second wave feminist movement in Trinidad in a group that was called the Concerned Women for Progress. And therefore my first sense, or if you like, my understanding of women's studies, gender and development studies, is really always about that marriage between academia and activism.
In particular, what would you say your interests are and your areas of specialization?
In fact, I was inspired by many things, but one of the things that I ended that first thesis with is that women needed a room of their own, the way Virginia Woolf, a room of one's own. And I felt education was the room of our own. In a strange way, it was the analogy or the metaphor that I was using. And education provided not just a lot of women, black women and other women, to make strides into any kind of either workspace, political or business community. Maybe not as much a business community, but certainly for Indian women and East Indian women, as we are called, the education was the path to that kind of success. So I felt it was important to understand education as the root. I moved on to do a master's in sociology, and then I went on to do a PhD thesis, which was called Gender Negotiations Among Indians in Trinidad. And this was actually carried out in the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, which is now a bona fide university. Then it was an institute. I was actually very fortunate to do that PhD through a scholarship supported by the then project of Women and Development Studies, which is a cooperative project between the University of the West Indies and the Ministry of Overseas Cooperation, I think it was called, with the Netherlands government. They extended the scholarship for me into 4 years. It was originally a 2-year scholarship. And that thesis that I did there was in social history. So my disciplines, as it were, kept accumulating and incrementing themselves as I found the problem I was trying to resolve, if you like, because every bit of research is a problem or a question that you set yourself. That thesis dealt with the post-migrant or question of women. Professor Rhoda Reddock had done her study on women and labor, and in a sense she had fleshed out and looked at the area of the broad landscape of women in Trinidad in particular, and certainly broadened it to the Caribbean. She had touched on Indian women to some extent. And during indentureship, one of the main discourses on women was that we were very much part of a group that men took advantage of in this way or the other, whether it was the recruiters or the men, the Indian men. But one experience of being an Indian girl growing up in the 50s, born in the 50s, and growing up with a very, very strong grandmother, and a very strong mother in some ways. And all the women I saw around me, the women I would see in Hindu weddings, in Muslim churches, in the village, I didn't understand them in this sense of submissiveness and obsequiousness and passivity, with which the Indian woman had come to be seen. I felt I needed to understand why this mythology, or why this discourse emerged. Why did we think about Indian women in this way? So I set myself the problem of understanding what happened in the phases of indentureship and post-indentureship that would have allowed for this kind of emergence of a narrative on Indian women. So I came up with a thesis which is called Gender Negotiations, which is examine how Indian women negotiated their relationships, negotiated the constraints of a very patriarchal system that they had inherited from India, and how in doing so they both were able to accommodate certain things that was necessary for the community building that was being established in a post-indentureship, post-migrant situation, but at the same time were able to move out of estates, build houses with their families, educate their children, and find spaces in which they can have freedoms themselves. In a sense, I was an inheritor of that. So I was trying to understand the past in that respect. And the PhD thesis did that. It is like trying to imagine if you have been born into a society, how do you understand your place in that society? How do you understand your historical role, your historical positioning? How do you free yourself of the burdens and the images that people have imposed on you if you want to be able to see yourself freely? And to be able to be creative in that society, not just for your group, but for the wider society. And for me, all of that was a building ground. So again, I'm coming back to the point that a disciplinary inquiry for me was never singly an academic degree. It was about an academic and activist space. Knowledge for me is power. Therefore, after several years, I had begun to think not just of the Trinidad and Tobago, having lived abroad several times and looked at the Caribbean from abroad. And by this time having worked in Jamaica, because I also, after finishing the PhD, came back and was the first head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, then the Center for Gender and Development Studies at Mona. And working there for a period of 8 years, I began to understand the Caribbean in its depths more. In Trinidad, we talk about slavery and its products and its results. In Jamaica, I felt you understood it more. You understood the depth of slavery, you understood the impact of slavery. I had always, since I was a child, been a painter, Sunday painter, of course, and an attempt to be an artist, a photographer of sorts. And the growth of the digital age has offered a new dimension to how one can do research. And therefore I moved into an area that I call iconography. But really it was about creating another way of seeing the Caribbean through a visual lens. And I looked at 500 years of Caribbean history through the image in a book called Imaging the Caribbean, Culture and Visual Translation. I had moved from understanding Trinidad and my space in Trinidad to understanding the Caribbean and our place in the Caribbean and the Caribbean in the world, given the fact that the Caribbean had been a precocious experiment in New World exploration and New World development. So this is a long-winded way of perhaps answering your question, to say that my disciplines and my movement into gender studies has been incremental all the time, and I've constantly added and built on gender. When I did Imaging the Caribbean, it was not leaving gender aside. It was not shifting away from gender. It was using the lens that gender had shown me, the insights that the gender had shown me, that if you look closely, the invisible really can be made visible. And the image was a visible part of what had not been constructed in our history. And I felt that had to be brought together.